Well, good morning, WCC. Good to see all of you here in person, and those of you joining us online, great to have you once again. As we are in this incredible story, we're about halfway through this series on the church, and we're looking at the first part of the book of Acts, and it's really a narrative of how things got started and what our heritage and what we're all about, really. And, we began with this whole idea that Jesus said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And to ensure that, at Pentecost, he breathed his Spirit into every person who calls on the name of Christ from that day forward, and that includes us today. And then the next week, Scott talked about the first sermon, and thousands of people responded that day. And then the next week, I talked about, this early church and this kind of unity and compassion they had that was unheard of in that world. And last week is when the trouble kind of began for the church. I talked about the first miracle. And Peter and John got in a bunch of trouble for doing this kind thing by causing a lame man to walk in the name of Jesus. And they ended up in jail over that, and that's where we're going to pick up the story today. And then we're going to follow up with something that I think was a problem for the early church and is a challenge and a problem for us today as well. So let's just begin by taking a look at the text that I'm going to be in this morning. It's going to be entirely from the first 13 chapters first 13 verses of chapter 4. And it goes like this. This is after they performed this miracle. The priests and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came up to Peter and John while they were speaking to the people. They were greatly disturbed because the apostles were teaching the people, proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. They seized Peter and John, and because it was evening, they put them in a jail until the next day. But many who heard the message believed, so the number of men who believed grew to about 5,000. There was this kind of explosive growth throughout the first 3 centuries of the church. The next day, the rulers, the elders, and the teachers of the law met in Jerusalem. Annas the high priest was there, and so were Caiaphas, John, Alexander, and others of the high priest's family. They had Peter and John brought before them and began to question them. By what power or what name did you do this? And this is where the trouble begins. Not only was there a miracle, but who gets credit for it? And we talked last week about how that first miracle points up exclusively to Jesus. Then Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, said to them, rulers and elders of the people, if we are being called to account today for an act of kindness shown to a man who was lame, and are being asked how he was healed, then know this, you and all the people of Israel, it is by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, but whom God raised from the dead, that this man stands before you healed. Jesus is the stone you builders rejected, which has become the cornerstone. Salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. You see, absolute claims like Jesus is the way, Jesus is the resurrection, Jesus is the life, and the only way to salvation got the early church in trouble. And I would suggest to you that it makes our life more difficult in this growing society of pluralistic thinking. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. You see, the early church existed in a very similar culture. But don't you sometimes wish that we could kind of just skip over these exclusive claims, these absolute claims like, well, Jesus is the only way. Because, we see these bumper stickers on cars that say coexist. And I believe as Christ followers, we should all want to coexist well with our neighbors. We should all want unity. We should all strive for harmony. But how does that work? How does the gospel work in a pluralistic society? Now, the word pluralism simply means a society where different groups keep their identity while existing with other groups. That would describe the U.S. perfectly. We have people from every tribe, every tongue, every race, every background, every language group, every way of thinking, every religion, every philosophy there is, and we're supposed to coexist. We're supposed to live in harmony. I certainly want that. But as we have seen in vivid color over the last year, it's not really happening very well, is it? We're as divided and angry with one another as we can ever be. And we live in a culture that is growing in this idea that if you don't accept everything about me, you don't accept anything about me. And when did that become a thing? But the society that the early church was birthed in was very similar. It was a pluralistic society. But today, and this is where I want to kind of look at what we can learn from the early church. Today, we are told as Christians to get with the times. We're told to wake up and to open our eyes and to, do whatever in order to say, you guys are so intolerant, you're so archaic, you're so superstitious and bigoted and all of those things. So what should we do? Well, I think there are three things we can learn from the early church, three lessons we can learn from this text that I just read you. The first thing is this. We're going to look at the problem with truth claims. It does create problems for those who make them. The second thing we're going to look at, and that we can learn from the early church, is the problem with truth claims. And that sounds like a lot, but I'll flesh that out for you. And then the third thing we can learn from the early church is the solution to the problem. So let's dive into the first one, the problem with truth claims. You see, the Jewish leaders responded very poorly to a miracle. Now, why would they respond so poorly to such a nice act, such a nice gesture? Because they were so set in their ways that this miracle and the identity of Jesus didn't line up with their belief system and what they had based everything on. So they rejected even a good thing. And this is kind of the culture that the early church kind of came out of, where the claim was Jesus is God. Now, you think about it, what was the only message, really the primary message of the early church? They didn't have the Bible like we have it today. They didn't say, we're going to study the epistles today, we're going to study the Gospels. They had one thing they talked about for a very long time. We saw this man named Jesus, we saw him crucified, we saw him alive again 3 days later. And now he lives in us, and I can't deny that. And they didn't deny it, and that was their message. And it got them in a tremendous amount of trouble, you see, because not only were they in trouble with the Jewish leaders, because that kind of went against, it almost seemed blasphemous to them, but Rome was officially a pluralistic society. Rome made it official. All religions, all philosophies, all people, all beliefs are tolerated and accepted. Kind of. Basically, they were a pluralistic society, and you could believe whatever you wanted, you could do whatever you wanted, as long as you worshiped the emperor. Well, that was a problem for the early church, because, like I said, they had seen Jesus alive, saw him dead on a cross, and more than 500 of them had seen him alive again 3 days later. He went to heaven and filled them with the Holy Spirit, which we learned about at Pentecost a few weeks ago. They couldn't deny Jesus, and they would never bow to Caesar, and so we can read throughout history. If you remember your world history, even in high school, millions of Christians were persecuted under the Roman Empire because, for one simple reason, not that they were bad people, they were actually really good people. They wouldn't worship the emperor, and that was worthy of death. And so this is kind of the world they live in, and it led to severe persecution, especially under the Nero and Caligula and some of those guys. Well, today in the U.S., there's a growing pluralism, isn't there? There's a growing embrace of that, and Christians are seen more and more as superstitious, foolish, outdated, bigoted, you name it. We're aligned with certain things, and it's usually not good. Now, that's the problem with truth claims, is when you claim anything absolutely, you're setting yourself up for criticism. But the second thing I think we can learn from this text is the problem with the problem of truth claims. The problem with truth claims. If you have a problem with truth claims, that creates a problem for you. Now, what am I talking about? I keep repeating myself. It sounds like I'm not really. I meant to say that. So here it goes. The idea in our culture is growing that when you get educated, when you become enlightened, you will see that all beliefs are pretty much the same. They're all kind of fables and stories, and if they help you cope, that's great. This is very Eurocentric. It's been happening in Europe for about 50 years, and it's finally made its way to the good old US of A, where if you are seen as not accepting all religions as equally valid, somehow or another you're seen as kind of stupid, kind of outdated, kind of closed-minded, kind of bigoted. You make these absolute claims. The irony of that is that this is cultural imperialism. Now, that's another word we're going to talk about. Imperialism simply is the rule or dominant philosophy of our day. Now, I realize the last 300 years or so, the dominant culture, the dominant philosophy or religion or culture of our country has been Judeo-Christian values, Christianity. And we've not always done a good job with that. Sometimes when you're the dominant belief system, you can be oppressive to people, and you can make it more of a cultural religion than a relationship with Christ. But that has shifted. If you had any illusions that this is a Christian nation, it isn't any longer. The growing philosophy is actually going the other way. Now, I say all that to say that basically we live in a culture today where it is increasingly, our culture is increasingly intolerant of any religion or belief system that they view as intolerant. Do you see the hypocrisy in that? I'm intolerant of you because I think what you believe is intolerant of me. I think because you're so close-minded, you're wrong. Is that or is that not an absolute statement? It seems as though it is to me, and it's very hypocritical. And here's the thing. To say there's no absolute truth is an absolute statement. And we hear that a lot, and a lot more in our culture. So where does this leave us as Christ followers? Because I really believe if we follow the example of Jesus, if we read the gospel, we, above all people, should want harmony and unity in our world. And we should love everybody if we are following the way of our founder, Jesus. But where does this leave us? Because frankly, there are sometimes I'm like, when I'm talking to somebody who I know struggles with faith, I'm like, well, yeah, so you're telling me Jesus is the only way? Yes. Well, that's just so close-minded. You feel strongly about that, don't you? Which makes you seem close-minded too. So let's talk as two close-minded people about the systems that shape our values and our beliefs. So we live in what has come to be known as a post-truth culture. Like, in other words, it means there's no absolute truth. There's really not an absolute truth. I mean, or everything is true. Like, your truth is your truth, right? My truth is my truth. We're just going to coexist and accept that about each other because there's really no absolute truth. So you just do you. And I think, well, this view that everything is truth or there's no absolute truth, I don't think that idea works very well. Why not? Well, just for one example. When you don't believe there's anything as absolute truth, it makes you helpless against injustice. Well, injustice is just wrong. Based upon what moral value system? Well, I just think it's wrong. So I read this interesting article a couple weeks ago in preparation for this about, I can't think of her name, but she's a British anthropologist, and she teaches at one of the well-known universities in England. And her specialty, at least during this period of her time professionally, was to study primitive tribes in Africa and their customs and their culture and their values and all of that. And what she found, there was this consistent value or lack of a value in each tribe. Women were treated horribly. I mean, they were treated like dirt. They were treated worse than animals sometimes. And where she felt conflicted in this is her professional convictions were, as an anthropologist, do not mess with cultures. Leave them alone. Don't screw them up. But that conflicted with her personal values of the value of women. As a feminist, she struggled tremendously with this. But so she's like, it really put her in a bind. She's like, her personal convictions were women should be treated well. I believe that too. All women should be, it's unthinkable. And I talked to my brother-in-law, who was a missionary in Africa. That's one of the first things he had to change when people started learning about Jesus. It's like, guys, quit beating your women, quit beating your children, quit treating everybody like they're your possessions. Treat them like human beings, like Jesus would. That was a very foreign concept. Todd said the same thing when he went to New Guinea. But she realized she had to she was in conflict with her own values. She couldn't stand it. So she said, well, I'm going to ignore my professional values and just leave culture alone because I can't stand to see women treated this way. And you see, kind of when you don't have any outside help, we're kind of left with that. When you don't believe there's absolute truth, we are helpless against, injustice, racism, greed, hatred. I mean, who are you to tell me I can't hate that group of people? I mean, who are you to tell me I'm wrong? My truth's my truth. Your truth's your truth. When you have no basis for truth other than what you think is true, it doesn't work. You see, if there is no God, then there is no standard outside of us to guide us. If there's no God, if you don't believe in God, then you can't believe in absolute truth because there's no standard outside of us. So it's whoever's in power or whatever you feel today, which will be different tomorrow. If there's no outside help to guide us to some true moral standards, we're kind of in trouble. So, you do you. Now, how's that working for us? I would suggest not very well. Which leads me to the third thing I think we can learn from the early church. I believe that there is a solution to this problem. You see, I think we're at a place right now as a society where people are starting to believe that we need moral values. Because this, like, you do you, it's thrown us into chaos. There is more division, more intolerance, more hatred than I've ever seen in my life. And we should be, aren't we evolving? Aren't we getting better and more enlightened and more educated? Shouldn't that help? It's not. And so, I think there's a solution to this. So I think people are wanting, they're beginning to see we need moral values, but we need values that are non-oppressive. Does that make sense to you? We want moral values, we just don't want oppressive moral values. And I think too often times what we've seen is, moral values, moral absolutes, we've oppressed people with those. I think what the world's looking for is something different than that. Moral values that actually make life better. And I think we have that. I think the gospel offers this. I think Jesus gives us exactly that, a set of moral values that is the opposite of oppressive. Look at Acts chapter 4, verse 11. Look at this text that I just read to you. And look at verse 11, and I'm going to kind of begin to flesh out what I mean by that. In verse 11, Luke writes, Jesus is the stone you builders rejected, which has become the cornerstone. You see, Jesus was rejected and beaten and crucified so that we could be saved. If we believe at the core of our belief system, at the core of our absolute belief system, that the God of the universe came to earth, submitted himself to humanity, made himself human, made himself homeless, allowed himself to be beaten, allowed himself to be executed for something he never committed a crime, and ultimately for God to come to earth in the person of Jesus to make himself killable. That's at the core of this belief system that we as Christians are being crucified over. And you see, when you truly follow Jesus, when you really believe that, you surrender all pretension and all air of superiority. You no longer have the right to see yourself as better than anyone else. In fact, Jesus had the audacity to tell us to even love our enemies. And Acts 4:13 shows us that the leaders of that day were dumbfounded by this idea. Look at what they said. These people who were following Jesus, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were just nobodies. That's really what they were saying. They were unschooled, ordinary men. They were down here compared to us. They were unclean, they were uneducated, they were this ragtag bunch of hooligans. They were astonished and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. You see, outside of the gospel, everybody's value is based upon works, based upon success, based upon income, based upon title, based upon looks, based upon athletic ability, academic ability. It's based upon something you worked hard for to earn. Everybody's value outside of the gospel. Best read I've ever read on this whole issue of grace. I mentioned him last week. One of my favorite authors, Philip Yancey. The book's probably 30 years old now. I've recommended it probably 20 times over the years. What's so amazing about grace? He said, you will find grace nowhere in the world, nowhere in society outside of the gospel. Nowhere. Because we do not live in a society of grace. We do not live in a world of grace. We live in a world of works. Where everybody's value is based on, and I would say, relative status. Now, what do I mean by relative status? Well, let's say you were a great musician in high school. Let's say you're the best saxophone player that's ever come out of Warsaw, Indiana. And you move to New York City to continue to hone your craft. You go to the best music school, music academy in New York City. You can tell I don't know music well, but there's one there. What would it be? Juilliard. Say you go to Juilliard. And let's say on your way to your first day of class at Juilliard, you see this guy on the corner playing a saxophone, and people are dropping money into the plate, and you're like, wow, he's way better than me. I was the best in Warsaw. I'm not so good here. And you see, this is where relative status is where we get our value and our identity. You could be the best. See, we don't care if we're the best. What we just care is that we're better than the next person. And we compare ourselves to the people that we're better at. And it's still about salvation by works in some sense, isn't it? I'm saved by my looks. I'm saved by my brains. I'm saved by my athleticism. I'm saved by my income. I'm saved by my title. I'm saved by my kids, my marriage, whatever it is. It's salvation by works. And the religious leaders in Jesus' day felt that same way. How could ordinary men be so extraordinary? Well, they had been with Jesus, and they were given a new identity that had nothing to do with what they brought. Nothing to do with their goodness, nothing to do with their works. Their new identity was given to them by Jesus himself. His goodness, his perfection, his love was given to them when they received him. It's called grace. Have you heard of it? Yes, I hope so. And if we believe this gospel, we can never feel superior to anyone. Because anything I have is a gift from the God of the universe. You see, think about it. Our religion and our exclusive claims, and yes, they are exclusive. I'm not going to apologize for that. But they're built on the idea that a man died, and those who were killing him, he forgave. When Jesus, who we believe is God in the flesh, came to earth, was beaten to within a lash of his life, was nailed to a cross with a crown of thorns placed on his head, and his executors are mocking him, and he has the power at his fingertips to destroy the whole Roman Empire. Instead, what does he do? Something way more powerful. Father, forgive them. They do not understand what they're doing. You see, we need more people in our world that believe in a truth that make them humble servants like Jesus. And I've had people say to me so many times, it's so exclusive and it's such a turnoff when you say Jesus is the only way. That's not my intent. I don't think that was the early church's intent. I mean, they'd seen him dead, then they saw him alive, and they were filled with his spirit. They couldn't help themselves because they had been with him. I can't help myself. And I'm sorry if it comes across as condescending or closed-minded, but when society tells me that all faiths lead to the same way, how is that not exclusive? And if I don't believe that, then somehow or another, they don't accept me. Ironic, isn't it? Because that's not what I say to them. You see, the gospel claims are an exclusive truth. But I would suggest to you that they are the most inclusive, exclusive truths in the history of the human race. Because all people are welcome through Jesus Christ. And we're taught by our founder to love even those who hate us. You see, the God of the Gospels is good. And if we just receive him, his goodness is given to us. And I don't know, it just seems like a good solution to the problems in our world right now. That we believe in a God that is so good that he gives his goodness to us along with a new identity, and we just become better people. And maybe our prayer should start being that we develop a bit of a reputation as people who have been with Jesus. That's not so bad, is it? And then maybe people will be okay with our claims. It's like, well, I don't know about that Jesus thing, but man, if he's anything like you, I want to hear more about him.